The Thanksgiving ritual on the plantation had never been written down, never declared out loud, yet everyone understood its shape, its weight, its cruel inevitability. It was a tradition born from power and sustained by fear, one the master performed with the same pride with which he carved his turkey or raised a toast to his own prosperity. He called it a lesson, a reminder of order, a necessary spectacle to keep the enslaved grateful. But to those forced to watch, it was something far darker, a yearly demonstration meant to hollow out the spirit and remind every soul on the property exactly how small their lives were beneath his boot. In the days leading up to Thanksgiving, the air itself seemed to tense. Conversations quieted. Eyes shifted toward the ground. The rustle of cane and cotton felt sharper, as if the fields themselves were bracing for the moment when laughter at the master's table would mingle with the crack of a whip. It was during these days that the overseers moved differently too, more alert, more eager to impress, knowing they would be asked to assist. The threat of being chosen hung over everyone like a storm cloud, and though no criteria were ever spoken, rumors always spread. This one angered the master last week, that one worked too slowly, another had been heard whispering after dark until nearly every person on the plantation was convinced they were next. This year, for reasons no one would name out loud, people kept glancing toward Elias. He worked in the fields with the same steady rhythm he always had, his body moving with a quiet precision that made him both invisible and unsettling. Elias had a strength that was not loud or boastful, but buried deep like the roots of the old trees along the property line. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was calm in a way that felt unnatural in a place where fear scraped at people's throats every hour of the day. Even the overseers, who prided themselves on reading defiance where none existed, struggled to understand him. Some whispered that the master had been watching him more closely this season, that he resented the way Elias never cowered quite enough, never shook quite the way others did, as if something in him refused to fully bend. Thanksgiving morning began with a brittle cold that crept into every corner of the cabins. The sky was a washed-out gray that threatened rain but withheld it, letting the heaviness settle over the land like a warning. Smoke drifted from the kitchen house as the enslaved cooks prepared the feast for the master's family and guests, their hands working quickly, mechanically, even as their ears strained for any hint of commotion outside. Every clang of a pot, every raised voice from the big house made their hearts jump. The fields were empty for the morning, which meant more labor would await them the next day, but the emptiness only made the silence worse. Elias worked near the edge of the main yard, repairing a section of fence the master had ordered fixed before nightfall. His movements were slow and deliberate, his focus intense, as though he were trying to disappear into the task itself. He could feel eyes on him, he knew the others were watching the way the overseers lingered nearby, watching the way the master had stepped out onto the porch 4 times already, scanning the yard with the casual cruelty of a man deciding which animal to slaughter. When the bell rang for the midday gathering, the enslaved were driven into position like livestock, lined up where the master wanted them, arranged in a way that allowed the Thanksgiving guests to glance over and marvel at the orderliness of the display. Elias stood among them, shoulders squared, jaw relaxed, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the house, toward the dense black woods that loomed behind the property. Every year, the master made a speech before choosing his target. He crafted it like a sermon, filling it with hollow righteousness and warped gratitude, dripping with the arrogance of a man convinced the world had been made to place him at its center. This year was no different. He raised his glass and spoke of blessing, of harvest, of providence, of loyalty. With each word he stepped closer to the line of enslaved people, pacing slowly, savoring the tension he created with every drifting pause. People avoided meeting his gaze, but they could feel it sliding over them, searching, selecting, savoring the dread. And then, almost too casually, he stopped directly in front of Elias. A murmur rippled through the line, soft as breath yet sharp enough to cut. Elias did not move. He did not lower his eyes. He simply waited, the stillness inside him settling deeper, as though something old and dormant had begun to stir. The master smiled in a way that made the air tighten. This, he seemed to say without speaking, would be the year's lesson, the year's entertainment, the year's reminder of who held power and who existed only because he allowed it. The ritual was about to begin, the cruelty about to bloom, the moment about to crystallize into something the plantation would never forget, even though none of them could yet sense the invisible line that had just been crossed, the one from which nothing and no one would ever return. The moment the master laid his hand on Elias during the Thanksgiving gathering, a current of cold fury rippled through the crowd, though no one dared show it. The touch was not merely a gesture of authority, it was a deliberate act of humiliation, meant to display ownership before the guests who watched with polite curiosity. The master gripped Elias's shoulder harder than necessary, fingers digging in as if testing the firmness of a horse he intended to break. A hush settled, thick enough to choke on. Elias didn't flinch, didn't shift his weight, didn't even raise his eyes. That stillness, the unshakable calm that had always defined him, was precisely what triggered the master's next move. He despised that quiet. He despised the way Elias never trembled, never scrambled to appease him with the frantic desperation he expected. And so, in front of everyone, he decided that this Thanksgiving would be different. He began circling Elias slowly, speaking loud enough for the guests to hear but soft enough that his tone carried an intimate cruelty. He mocked Elias's silence, questioned his usefulness, laughed that a man who spoke so little must have nothing worth saying. Every barb was designed to provoke, to draw a reaction, to peel back the dignity that Elias wore like a second skin. But Elias stood exactly as he always did, the muscles in his jaw set but not clenched, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the master's shoulder as though looking through him, not at him. The more composed Elias remained, the more the master spiraled into a performance of brutality. He yanked Elias forward by the collar, forcing him to his knees, pushing his head down toward the dirt in a grotesque parody of prayer. Gasps rose from the enslaved, quickly smothered. The guests shifted uneasily, even they sensed the tension twisting the air, though none would dare intervene. What no one saw, not even Elias at first, was the small crack beginning to run through something deep inside him. It wasn't immediate or explosive. It was quiet, a shift in the way he inhaled, a change in the steadiness of his heartbeat. As the master shoved him again, grinding his face toward the cold ground, Elias's vision darkened around the edges, not with fear but with memory. The pressure of the master's hand on the back of his neck mirrored another hand from his past, one belonging to a man who had beaten Elias's father to death when Elias was a child. The plantation had changed. The men in power had changed. But cruelty wore the same face across the years. And without meaning to, without realizing what memory he had awakened, the master pressed that wound until the old pain surged up, hot and blinding, and something dormant uncoiled within Elias like a snake disturbed after long sleep. The crowd saw Elias shift slightly, a subtle tightening in his shoulders. They assumed it was discomfort. Only the older slaves, those who had watched him grow from a skinny, quiet child, recognized the danger in that movement. They had seen that same posture years before, on a night when Elias, barely 12, had held down a panicked mule by the reins until it exhausted itself, his small arms steady with a strength no one understood. They had whispered ever since that Elias held his anger somewhere far inside, in a place no cruelty had ever pierced. Until now. The master dragged Elias upward again, jerking him to his feet with such force that Elias momentarily swayed. The world spun, not physically but emotionally, as if his memories and present reality had collided too quickly for his mind to separate them. He looked into the master's face for the first time that day, and instead of seeing the man before him, he saw echoes of every hand that had ever struck him, every bite of the whip, every insult that had been spat at the people around him. The rage was not loud. It did not roar through him like fire. It seeped in like cold water, filling every empty space left behind by years of silence. The master mistook Elias's lifted gaze for defiance and smiled triumphantly, convinced he had finally cracked the unbreakable man. He stepped closer, placing one hand beneath Elias's chin, tilting his head upward like one would examine livestock. The gesture was disrespectful, but what followed was worse. The master slapped him. Not a warning slap, not a furious lash of the hand. It was slow, measured, a deliberate statement that Elias was nothing, would always be nothing, and that this moment, this humiliation, would be the annual story guests would carry home with them. The sound echoed across the yard, a sharp report that silenced even the rustling leaves. Several slaves shut their eyes. A few turned away. The overseers shifted uneasily, sensing something wrong but unable to name it. Elias did not stagger. He did not wince. Instead, he straightened, rising to his full height, and the subtle change in his posture was enough for the atmosphere to shift. It was like watching a storm pull itself together, a tightening, a gathering of pressure, a vibration in the air no one could unfeel. His eyes no longer looked past the master, they locked onto him with a calm that no longer resembled obedience but something far more unnerving. For years Elias had swallowed his anger, burying it in a place so deep he had convinced himself it could never surface again. But the slap, the forced kneeling, the resurfaced memory of his father, the mocking tone, the laughter from the porch, it all converged into a single, unbearable truth. Silence had kept him alive, but it had never kept him free. The master sensed the shift an instant too late. His confidence faltered, his smirk drooping as Elias's expression changed in a way he could not understand. The enslaved people sensed it too. They felt the world teeter, as if the soil beneath them had tilted slightly out of alignment. They understood that something irreversible had begun to take shape. The rage inside Elias was no longer contained, no longer smothered beneath years of forced submission. It had risen, patient and precise, and it waited in the quiet space between one breath and the next, ready to transform the entire world with a single, devastating decision. The moment the master stepped back to deliver another insult, the plantation seemed to exhale all at once, as though every tree, every fence post, every watching soul sensed the invisible thread holding Elias together finally unravel. No one could explain later exactly how it happened, because the act itself occurred in a span of time too thin for the human eye to fully grasp. One heartbeat Elias stood frozen in that eerie calm, and in the next, he moved with a speed and precision none of them had ever witnessed from any man, let alone one who had endured a lifetime of chains. The master barely registered the shift before Elias's hand shot upward, catching him not in anger but in a cold, deliberate grasp that halted his next gesture midair. Gasps rose from the enslaved, but they were small, strangled things, the kind people make when they know sound might draw danger toward them. Even the overseers hesitated, unsure whether to shout or reach for their weapons, confused by the unnatural fluidity of Elias's movement, as if he had rehearsed this moment in silence for years. The master tried to pull his arm back, but Elias tightened his grip with an effortless strength that drained the color from the man's face. The guests stood frozen on the porch, their holiday cheer evaporating as they realized the performance they had been enjoying had turned away from cruelty and toward something far more unpredictable. Elias's expression did not twist into rage, did not flare with the wild violence they might have expected. Instead, he looked almost serene, his jaw relaxed, his eyes steady, his breathing slow. It was this calm that terrified those who watched. It suggested that nothing about this was impulsive or frantic. The stillness radiating from him made the moment feel preordained, as if fate had been circling this precise second for years, waiting for Elias to finally step into it. The master opened his mouth, perhaps to command or threaten or plead, none would ever know. Elias acted before the first syllable could form. His free hand rose and wrapped around the back of the master's neck with the same steady confidence with which he once handled skittish livestock, guiding them gently but firmly. There was no brutality in his touch, only certainty, a chilling assurance that told everyone watching there would be no hesitation, no second thoughts, no mercy. For a breathless instant, the entire yard held still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though unwilling to interfere. The enslaved stared in stunned silence, their hearts pounding so loudly in their ears they might have mistaken the sound for distant thunder. And then it happened. Not with grotesque violence or wild force, but in one horrifyingly precise motion. A twist, swift and exact, guided not by fury but by a deep, controlled finality. The sound that followed, soft, abrupt, unmistakable, cut through the yard like a crack in ice. It wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than the roar of a cannon, a sound that would echo in the memories of every witness for the rest of their lives. The master's body went slack instantly, his head tilting unnaturally as Elias released him and stepped back with the same calmness he had shown moments before. For several seconds, no one moved. The overseers stood rigid, their hands hovering near their belts but refusing to grip the weapons they were trained to use. The guests remained frozen in their seats, faces drained, unable to process the shift from festive cruelty to sudden death. The enslaved stared not at the body crumpled on the ground, but at Elias, the quiet man who had always seemed to exist on the edges of their world, who had endured everything with the patience of stone, who had now become the center of a moment that defied understanding. What unsettled them most was that Elias did not appear triumphant. There was no adrenaline in his posture, no trembling, no wildness in his gaze. He simply stood there, breathing evenly, as if a weight he had carried his whole life had suddenly fallen away. The atmosphere around him changed, thickened, as though the air recognized that something unnatural had awakened within him, something that did not belong to the ordinary world. Several of the older laborers whispered later that they had seen a faint shimmer around Elias in that moment, like heat rising off stone, though none dared to speak of it where overseers might hear. The overseers finally lurched into motion, but even then, they moved cautiously, circling Elias the way one might circle a wild animal whose strength and intentions were unknown. The body of the master lay still in the dirt, neck tilted at an angle that made several guests look away. A few of the enslaved felt tears sting their eyes, not grief, but a molten mix of awe, terror, and the staggering realization that someone among them had done the unthinkable. Elias seemed to sense their gaze. He slowly looked around at the crowd, his expression unreadable, and for a fleeting instant, something old and ancient glimmered behind his eyes, something that suggested he had not simply reacted in anger but had chosen a path that had been set long ago. He turned his attention to the edge of the woods, just beyond the yard, where the trees stood tall and unmoving. A strange sensation washed over the onlookers, as if the forest itself had leaned forward in anticipation, as if Elias belonged to something larger, deeper, more primal than any of them understood. The overseers, sensing the fragile edge between bravery and death, stepped forward at last, but Elias didn't wait for their commands or threats. The moment hung suspended, fragile as an icicle ready to fall, and though no words were spoken, everyone felt the unseen force pushing the story forward. The next snap had shattered not just a man, but the boundaries of the world they thought they understood, and Elias stood at the center of it, transformed, dangerous, and impossibly calm, preparing to make the next move. No one could predict the instant Elias released the master's lifeless body. The yard erupted into motion, but none of that frantic energy reached him. The overseers lunged forward with shouts torn from their throats, but those shouts carried more fear than authority. Elias did not run at first. He simply stood there, as though measuring the distance between himself and the tree line, his gaze fixed on the dark stretch of forest that edged the plantation like a waiting mouth. The enslaved people, frozen in their shock, sensed it too, the pull of the woods, the strange hush that had settled over the air, the way the shadows under the pines seemed to thicken as though gathering around a place reserved for him. When Elias finally moved, it was with a quiet certainty that unsettled those watching more than the killing itself. He took one step toward the trees, then another, and the overseers gave chase, spurred less by loyalty to the dead master and more by the panicked instinct to stop something they no longer understood. Elias crossed the yard in long, deliberate strides, his body aligning with a kind of purpose that felt unnatural to witness. The overseers reached for him, but he slipped from their grasp with a fluidity that resembled instinct more than skill. One managed to seize a corner of his shirt, but Elias turned sharply, and the fabric tore free like old paper. That same overseer fell to one knee as though struck by an invisible force, clutching his hand as if it had been wrenched backward, though Elias had never touched him. The others hesitated, exchanging terrified glances that betrayed the truth they didn't dare say aloud. Whatever Elias had become in that moment, he was no longer a man they knew how to subdue. By the time they recovered enough nerve to continue, Elias had reached the edge of the woods. He paused only once, looking over his shoulder, not at the overseers, not at the guests, not even at the enslaved who watched from their rigid line. His eyes drifted briefly toward the sky, as if listening to something carried on the wind, a call or warning or promise that only he could hear. Then he stepped into the tree line and vanished. Not gradually, not swallowed slowly by distance. One step, then darkness, then gone. Several overseers charged in after him, shouting for dogs, weapons, anything. But the forest beyond the plantation was a place people avoided even in daylight. The trees grew thick, pressing together like ribs of some ancient creature, their roots coiling over each other in patterns older than the oldest family in Little Rock. Folks whispered legends about those woods of lost hunters, of strange tracks too large to belong to any animal known to Arkansas, of nights when the trees cracked under unseen weight. It was not a place men willingly entered, and certainly not a place they chased killers into. Still, Duty, or fear of what would happen if they failed, drove them a few yards in. But the deeper they pushed, the colder the air grew, as if winter lurked only in those shadows. Sound dimmed. Even their own breathing became muffled, swallowed by a quiet that felt wrong. The dogs refused to cross the threshold, planting their paws in the dirt and whining, tails tucked tight as though sensing the forest's displeasure. Torches flickered, their flames thinning as if the darkness were feeding off their light. The overseers tried to call out to Elias, not out of negotiation but out of desperation, trying to pierce the suffocating stillness with their shouts. There was no reply. Instead, a single cracking sound echoed somewhere deeper within, a heavy, splintering noise that made the men stop, stomachs twisting with dread. It sounded exactly like a tree trunk being snapped in half, yet it was rhythmic, deliberate, too controlled to be mere storm damage. The overseers exchanged looks, realizing that whatever caused that noise moved with purpose. Something big. Something strong. Something that understood exactly where it wanted to go. They retreated, stumbling backward until the sunlight touched their boots again. Panic was plain on their faces, though none wanted to admit they had felt fear, that the woods seemed to swallow sound and hope alike. They insisted Elias couldn't have gone far, but deep down, each man knew those trees had taken him the way the river took stones, pulling him somewhere unreachable. When they returned to the plantation yard, the enslaved people stood silently, their expressions impossible to read. Some looked shaken. Others looked quietly awed. A few stared at the forest with a kind of grim understanding, as though they had always known Elias was not meant for the world beyond those trees. By nightfall, word had spread across the property that the search had failed. The overseers claimed Elias was injured, exhausted, and would surely collapse somewhere in the woods, making capture inevitable. But their bravado rang hollow, especially after the livestock began behaving strangely. Horses paced their stalls, eyes rolling wildly at shadows. Chickens refused to roost, gathering restlessly as though expecting something to strike from above. Dogs barked at the tree line until hoarse, retreating with tails between their legs whenever they got too close. The enslaved workers noticed other signs too, the way certain branches near the edges of the woods drooped unnaturally low, cracked in clean lines as if bent by tremendous force, the faint, eerie tremor that traveled through the ground at irregular hours, the distant, impossible sound of something moving, not like a man but like something heavier, something that displaced the very air around it. Each night, the woods felt closer, as though creeping forward by inches, watching patiently. People began to murmur that Elias had not just escaped into the forest, he had been claimed by it. Their whispers held no malice, only a wary respect for forces older than the plantation and cruelties harsher than any man could impose. No one slept easily. The overseers doubled their patrols but refused to venture near the tree line after sunset. Thanksgiving ended with more fear than celebration, and long after the lamps in the big house went dim, the sound of branches snapping echoed in the dark, carrying the unmistakable rhythm of something walking with slow, heavy, purposeful steps, as though testing the boundaries between the world of men and the deep. Ancient hunger waiting within the forest's heart. In the days that followed Elias's disappearance into the woods, a dread settled over the plantation like a sickness that refused to lift. It was not the loud, frantic kind of fear that grips people in moments of crisis, but a slower, heavier dread that seeped into every corner of life, turning ordinary noises into omens and shadows into warnings. The master's death had torn a hole in the order everyone was forced to accept, and into that hole flowed whispers, quiet at first, then bolder as if the land itself had begun to speak. At night, the enslaved people heard sounds from the forest that did not belong to any creature they knew, heavy footfalls, low groans like wood bending under immense weight, and sometimes a sharp, wet crack that echoed too cleanly, too purposefully, like the snapping of thick branches or bones. The overseers dismissed these noises as tricks of the wind, but the terror in their voices betrayed their disbelief. They avoided the woods now even in daylight, circling the tree line like men skirting the edge of a grave they feared might widen beneath them. Rumors began spreading across neighboring plantations as well. Smokehouse workers claimed they saw silhouettes moving between the pines at dawn, tall, broad-shouldered shapes that vanished before fully forming. A hunter from 2 miles away insisted he found the carcass of a buck with its neck twisted so violently its antlers had embedded into the soil. A traveling preacher passing through Little Rock muttered to his companion that the woods felt watched, and that the trees seemed too still, too expectant, as though waiting for something to emerge. Each story, no matter how exaggerated, returned to the same quiet conclusion whispered with equal parts fear and awe. Elias was still out there, and he was no longer the man they had known. Inside the slave cabins, no one dared speak of Elias too loudly. Some prayed for him. Some feared him. Some believed he had been possessed by a force older than the soil itself, a spirit that had awakened when Elias crossed the boundary between suffering and defiance. And some, especially those who had endured the master's cruelty for decades, felt a strange comfort when the night carried the faint sound of something large and powerful moving through the underbrush. The children were warned not to wander near the woods, not because Elias would harm them, but because no one understood what he had become or what rules governed him now. The elders exchanged glances when strange noises drifted from the pines, and though they did not say it aloud, many suspected Elias no longer walked entirely as a man. Something had changed the moment he killed the master, something that threaded through him like a second spine, something that gave his silence a new, predatory stillness. The overseers, stripped of their usual bravado, turned their fear into brutality. They beat workers for minor mistakes, barked orders with trembling voices, and slept with weapons beside their beds. But cruelty could not mask what kept them waking in cold sweats, the knowledge that they had lost control. They organized search parties, but none dared venture deeper than a few yards into the forest. Each attempt ended the same way, with men returning pale, shaken, claiming the woods grew darker too quickly, that the air pressed against their chests, that footsteps followed them despite seeing no one. One man quit outright, refusing to set foot on the plantation again. He told the others he could feel eyes watching him from between the trees, eyes that were neither animal nor human but something patient, something judging. The new master, a cousin summoned to claim the property, arrived with a rigid belief in his own authority. He dismissed the overseers' fears, calling them superstitious fools, and swore he would restore order. To prove his point, he marched to the edge of the woods one morning with a rifle slung over his shoulder and shouted into the trees, calling Elias a coward, a heathen, a savage hiding behind shadows. His voice rang out confidently at first, but the woods swallowed his words instead of carrying them, leaving the air strangely hollow. He shouted again, louder. Silence answered. Onlookers held their breath. And then, from deep within the forest, something replied. Not a voice. Not an animal cry. A long, resonant crack, like an enormous limb breaking under deliberate pressure. The new master stiffened, lowering his rifle. Another crack followed, closer this time, too steady, too rhythmic to be natural. He backed away without giving orders, without speaking, without meeting the eyes of the people who had witnessed his fear. From that morning on, he avoided the woods entirely. As winter crept in, frost clinging to the fields and cabins, the sightings grew more frequent. Shapes moved between the trees at dusk, gliding with an eerie smoothness. Footprints appeared in the mud, deep impressions too large and wide to match any man's foot. One night, the plantation bell clanged violently though no wind stirred, and the rope was later found split cleanly in two as though sliced by an impossibly sharp force. Animals continued to behave strangely. Cows refused to graze near the eastern pasture. Horses reared violently at the slightest approach from the tree line. Even the birds abandoned that side of the property, leaving the branches above unnervingly still. But the most chilling event occurred on a night heavy with fog, when the enslaved awoke to the sound of something moving along the cabins, not quickly, not aggressively, but with slow, deliberate steps that pressed the earth as though each footfall carried tremendous weight. No one dared open a door or shutter. They sat in silence, hearts pounding, listening as the steps paused near each doorway, lingering long enough for their breath to turn to ice in their lungs. Then the steps drifted toward the woods again, fading into the soft cracking of branches and the low groan of shifting earth. In the morning, every cabin door bore the same mark, a clean, shallow gouge carved into the wood, not threatening, not random, but purposeful, as if Elias, or the thing he had become, was counting, checking, assuring himself of who still lived under the weight of the place he had escaped. To some, the marks meant protection. To others, a warning. But everyone understood one terrifying truth: Elias had not vanished. He had changed form, changed purpose, changed allegiance. And now he watched the plantation the way a hunter watches the forest at night, quiet, unseen, patient, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough and the world that had broken him would feel the full weight of what it had unleashed.